Our age is one of radical alienation, but what often is papered over is what made that alienation possible. A complete ontological transformation of what was called the commons. We speak in high school about its tragedy, but rarely do we actually see a delineation of the production of this notion and its betrayal throughout the history of thought. But we're not here to do that today. Today, we're taking a romantic excursion into excess. Rather than enclosure, we are seeking out those fragments of excess that talk about disenclosure, the possibility of a radical openness that comes with the refutation of measure, the refutation of property, a change of work, and the loss of all things that tie us down. Today, Acid Horizon has the remarkable pleasure of speaking with a thinker who I've been deeply influenced by, Joseph Albernaz. You probably have seen some of his work on Hölderlin or the radical Black tradition, or frankly, the Romantic tradition. And he is also the author of Common Measures, Romanticism and the Groundlessness of Community. Thanks for coming on the show, Joseph.
Thanks so much, Will. It's really a pleasure to speak with y'all. I've been a fan of the pod for some years now, so it's really a delight.
So you're dealing with romantic poetry in this text, and the connotation that romantic poetry carries, at least in the contemporary sense, is a largely negative one in relation to politics. Romanticism, in its colloquial disposition, is seen as a kind of ecologically laden, reactive, and nostalgic comportment towards the world. What do you think is missing in an analysis of Romanticism today that might have made a book like this necessary?
That's certainly true. A lot of evil has been laid at the feet of Romanticism, for sure. Not all of that with no good reason, right? I mean, when we think about the romantic nationalisms of the 19th century, I mean, that's how they're talked about, because a lot of these movements come out of ideas about nation or peoplehood that, romantic writers were purveying. So for me, I think of Romanticism as an open category, or I think I use this phrase in the book, an open set, right? So it becomes available for different configurations and constellations. It's not my intention to kind of absolve Romanticism of some of its darker histories, but I also think that as this open set, it is constantly something that's making available a new relation to the present, right? It's something that is, I think, even more so than other literary movements or periods, it's something that's untimely, right? And so the kind of constellation of Romanticism that I was interested in drawing out for myself for this book, for the present, is one that insisted on a certain view of the common or of community that is groundless. And so this would be opposed to the more kind of nostalgic, reactionary, nationalistic Romanticisms that do have a vision of community, but attempt to ground that community on a common essence or substance or identity or race, right? And give it some kind of content, right, that becomes violent and exclusionary. That is there in certain strands of Romanticism. But the Romanticism that I'm interested in is one that kind of is interested in fissures and fragmentation and a kind of disenclosing of any borders around identity that is ungrounded, we could say.
I think that opens us up for the next question really well, which is in the introduction to your book, which I think is like a remarkable piece on its own. You talk about the period of primary accumulation and the enclosure of not just space, but of a kind of existence, a mode of life. And you write that for Marx, the destruction of pre-modern communal forms and the triumph of capitalism were sealed when capital conquered the field through enclosure and the theft of common lands. You follow this up by saying, the Romantic poem cultivates a counterfield of groundless thinking, acting, dwelling, sharing, and imagining in common. And I want to sort of step back because I think that there's a really fascinating Marxist maneuver happening here. But in what ways do you differentiate your notion of measure, which seems to be one of the grounding elements of a particular conception of community you're trying to break free from, let's say, a rather pallid or historically played out notion of just abstraction?
There's a lot to say there. I mean, measure being in the title is like one of kind of the key concepts of the book. So maybe we could enter that by going back to Marx, thinking about primitive accumulation or real and formal subsumption, right, into the commodity economy, which is based on, a kind of general equivalence that's mediated through the money form, right? And this is something that is a long process of historical and social transformation, but it's the long 18th century, so into the early 19th century in England is where you have really the kind of final and strongest phase of enclosure and primitive accumulation, and the birth of industrial capitalism. And this is kind of wreaking havoc on all kinds of communities and forms of life. And one kind of rubric that I found helpful to think about that is measure, is some kind of subjecting them to like forms of social and economic measure, things that were previously kind of incommensurable or unmeasurable, be it time, all right? We think about the measure of the wage and the rise of wage labor, or social life, or even thinking about kind of new technologies of race as a way of measuring and hierarchizing beings, right, within this global world system. So, I mean, this is a kind of a familiar story, right? And I do draw a lot from Marx and Marxist thought and kind of historiography of enclosure. But where things get really interesting is the fact that if we think about poetry, of course, later you do have the mention of free verse, but for the vast majority of the history of poetry is language that is measured, right? That is put in meter and kind of counted out, and there are certain strict forms and rules which you can always break, right? And good poets always break the rules, but they break the rules knowing the rules about measure, right? Counting syllables and scanning in prosody a certain kind of cluster of language. So measure in the book for me is not, it's an ambivalent concept. Most of the time it is this rubric for the kinds of violent categorization and subsumption of forms of common life that I'm interested in, like the movements that opposed that. But at the same time, measure is also poetry, right? It is. And so I'm interested precisely in that kind of that moment of intersection to find how the kind of immanent measure of poetic language actually opens up ways of dwelling, thinking, writing, being, speaking in common that are themselves incommensurable with any kind of external form of measure or the commodity economy.
I just wanted to ask sort of what are kind of the paradigmatic sort of romantic poets you would take in a tradition of a kind of immanent critique of, let's say, the Enclosure Act. I mean, for me, as soon as you talk about enclosures and poetry, I always go back to this poem, which is anonymously attributed. I don't think it's actually, I think it's essentially a folk poem. I don't believe it actually has a determinate author, which is usually shortened to its first stanza, which is, I'll just read the first stanza out here. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose off from the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. That is kind of the traditional sort of paradigm there. But I know it's also a tradition of, say, Romanticism coming out of sort of the Luddite tradition. I know that's also been read as romantic. I'm going back to an episode a long time ago with Patrick Eidenhofer, who was a big defender of, he's the rare Lukácsian defender of Romanticism. But I just wanted to ask, what are sort of the paradigm cases of these poets and what makes them, I guess, romantic in a way which pushes against the, as you say, the sort of standard academic reception of Romanticism as, in some sense, inherently reactionary.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So I think I listened to that episode with Patrick Eidenhofer, which was fantastic, right? And so he's drawing on this tradition of romantic anti-capitalism and revolutionary romanticism through figures like Henri Lefebvre and Michel Levy, right? So I'm certainly aligned with that, closer to that kind of form of thinking. But, but my work also and draws a lot from kind of the continental kind of deconstruction tradition as well. But maybe we can revisit that in a bit. But to go more to your question, to get into some of the poetry, I mean, a central figure here will be someone like John Clare, who's writing directly about the enclosure of the commons, right? Claire is someone who grew up in a village called Helpston. And when he was 16, the village was enclosed by an act of parliament. So he kind of grew up and had an adolescence seeing the world of the commons and these kind of forms of subsistence, and then saw the trauma, which has been called by one critic like an ontological trauma, even, of enclosure. And his entire career is kind of writing about this lost commons. And under a certain kind of superficial view, there is a lot of nostalgia there. But what I try to take in Claire is rather his bearing towards language, right? To understand that like this kind of unbordered, ungrounded, never fully capturable common feeling and common dwelling is present in poetic language, what he calls a language that is evergreen, right? Which he also writes in rhythms that he wants to be adequate to the birds and the moles in the ground, right? And the plants and the flora and fauna that he knew so well and that were being kind of destroyed with the building of hedgerows and fences and the privatization of this land. So that's a good example too, where on a certain reading, Claire is a kind of nostalgic writer for the old Merry England that's been lost, right? But I think he actually is a much more interesting philosophical, deeper, and even radical writer, insisting on a kind of preservation of what has been lost in a possible renewal through language, right? And it's precisely language that is both is never fully enclosable and never fully ownable, right? So with Claire and with really all the writers I'm looking at, it's about the kind of unownable capacity of language to teach us how we can live differently, right? Even in the face of enclosure, in the face of violence, in the face of the new enclosures that we face today and in 2025, AI, which would be just one of them.
If I were to attend a class run by you on the topic of Romanticism and the commons and so forth, I mean, you've already covered a couple of thinkers here, but when I think of the Romantics, I think of William Blake. Amongst Germans, we can throw Schelling in there, and maybe even Jean-Jacques Rousseau might be part of that tradition as well. But if you were to put together a list or a syllabus of 5 go-to texts on this particular topic, since this is the second time that we've encountered this topic on the podcast, whom would you choose? And maybe in there, could you also mention which thinkers are you thinking against in the Romantic tradition? Maybe some of those who had the more nationalist inclinations or the identitarian impulses. Maybe flag up some of those authors as well and share your objection.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's make a little syllabus here.
Let's do it.
So one figure who's a kind of a fascinating philosopher and poet that comes up in the book is Friedrich Hölderlin. And so I talk about this very strange, mysterious text called The Communism of Spirits, which I also translated. And I argue, I haven't done about a bunch of research on this text, argue that it's the first use of the word communism in German or any language. And it features it's a dialogue featuring these 2 young men kind of looking at a church, and it's medieval church that's been abandoned, and they're saying they're kind of on the one hand flirting with this temptation of nostalgia, like, oh, wasn't it great in the Middle Ages when everything was in its right place and there was a proper hierarchy and there was transcendence that grounded all of this kind of this collective life. But then they end up saying, but this is gone forever. It cannot come back. And so the question becomes, how do we constitute a new common life in the face of this loss of a transcendent guarantee? So it's a short text too. So that's a good one for any kind of reading list and kind of the radical commons of Romanticism. You mentioned Blake, so I think he's a central figure for me.
Can I interrupt you on that real quick? The night that we met months ago in Brooklyn, I popped into Unnameable Books, and I don't remember, I think I sent you a picture of a book on Blake because, look, I have the Blake reader sitting right here. Mm-hmm. But if I were to pick up a single book on Blake that not only has the poetry, but maybe some of the commentary alongside it, of course, and maybe we want the illuminated manuscripts as well. Is there one that you would recommend?
A book? Do you mean a book about Blake?
Maybe a mix of both. Maybe like with a solid introduction or like adjoining essays, and then of course Blake's poetry besides.
Yeah, there are a lot of good editions. I mean, in the 60s, I think, and it's still in print, and this might be the one you have. Harold Bloom edited a Blake kind of collected poems with a huge amount of commentary, which is absolutely insane in the good way. It's before Bloom kind of became all like yelling at clouds, more nostalgic figure himself. But in his earlier period, he was kind of a visionary critic. And so that, I mean, it's called the Collected Blake, I think, the complete poetry and prose of Blake. If you take it with a grain of salt, it's not necessarily the most solid scholarly volume, but it has a kind of a visionary and indeed romantic commentary by a kind of, reading Blake as a kind of a Gnostic heretic and a millenarian apocalyptic, which he was, right? You can't go wrong with that.
Since we're now on the topic of William Blake, the third chapter of your book is on William Blake is titled Non-Sovereign Circulations. And you spend a lot of time sort of delineating the history of the notion of sovereignty and its kind of uncomfortable familiarity with circulation, not just commodity circulation, but something I think far more, I'm using this word that I hate to use in this way, but far more ontologically potent. Can you explain a little bit what you think the relationship between circulation and sovereignty is, and why it was so important to articulate this kind of discursive pairing?
Yeah, thank you. So I read the Blake in the Blake chapter. I read Blake as a political thinker of sovereignty and a critic of sovereignty. And the view on circulation there is kind of two-sided. There's sovereign and non-sovereign circulations, right? So to start with this notion of sovereignty, right? I actually start, I think, early in that chapter reading not Hobbes, but Harvey, who's the 17th century kind of medical writer who just kind of discovers and maps the circulation of the blood and being pumped by the heart. And he starts his 17th century medical text by praising the king and saying, oh, the king, the sovereign, you are like the heart, right? So and I kind of start from there and think about the metaphorics and of circulation and sovereignty, and also, more literally economic circulation of goods and money and the kind of rise of the capitalist economy, to think about a kind of circulation that is grounded in a center, right? We think of as a sovereign center, right? And that circulation refers at all its different nodes or moments or movements around a certain circuit to a ground, to a sovereign first principle that makes all of its kind of nodes equivalent. And I think, tries to, the way I read Blake, he thinks this kind of circulation tries to like stamp out anything that would be excessive or aberrant, right? What he offers instead of this is a kind of radical critique of sovereignty. And then I'm also drawing on Bataille and his view of sovereignty. And Bataille was a really keen reader of Blake, which not a lot of people have written about. So that's also something I go into. But this kind of non-sovereign circulation, I argue for Blake, strangely enough, goes under the rubric of forgiveness, right? Which for Blake takes on a radically expanded meaning from our normal kind of just everyday use of that phrase. And for Blake, forgiveness is a way of allowing excess to circulate rather than trying to capture it for an equivalent and a kind of notion of equivalence that refers to a sovereign center. So it's a kind of excessive movement that you see also in the way he writes and the way he puts together his texts and his images, that kind of in his very particular meaning of the word, that forgives, so allows and opens this kind of this circulation of what is excessive in every being, right? What opens every being to what is not itself, right? And this is the kind of more poetic view of a circulation without a ground, without a center, that binds us in common without any kind of common identity, that I think is really central for Blake.
I just wanted to single out a passage from this chapter that I thought was really extremely moving, and I think really telling about something that's sort of missing in some of the other thinkers that you're talking about, Agamben, Nancy, Derrida, all of whom you find like this romantic kernel in a way that I really appreciate. Like, this book is as much a book about romantic poetry, but if you're a Bataille person, if you're an Agamben person, if you're a Nancy person, this book is for you. If you're a Derrida person, this book is definitely for you, especially because of the Rousseau section. But This one passage really struck me, and I'm going to steal from it a lot, probably. This Blakean concept of life, a non-vitalist movement of living, will be crucial for delineating Blake's vision of community. The point is that we are already sinning as we live. We are also always already forgiving, sharing the excess and open circulation of life. Quote, the general openness and commonness of life. And I think that it's precisely this kind of ethical gesture that allows for an understanding of circulation that can, at any point, become an ethical motion to short circuit the very kinds of movements that we find constricting. You know, I'm thinking of that passage in To Our Friends by the Invisible Committee, where they're speaking about the unemployed movement and disabled workers movement in France. And they say that they already know that to not be circulated is to be subject to death. And that, in fact, it's this kind of circulation that has to be overthrown. And this opening to the excess, this point of schism, is something that I think you bring a particular light to as it pertains to romantic poetry. But I want to pass it over to Craig, because I know he has a question about Bataille, and I want to find out if his question is exactly the one I was thinking it was going to be.
Well, putting me on the spot as usual, but I do have a question about Bataille. And I'll say that when I initially encountered this book, and by the way, Stanford Press sent this to me for free, so shout out to them for doing that. And isn't it on sale right now, Joe?
50% off on the website. Yeah.
30% off, is that what you said?
Off, actually.
50, yeah.
50, excellent. Okay. Well, in any case, I read the introduction and then I read the chapter on Hölderlin. And it wasn't until over the past few days that I read the chapter on Blake and Bataille. But I think you really sort of whittle down the problem in that chapter on Bataille. And it's something that we've talked about in the podcast quite a bit in different contexts, whether it's the notion of inoperativity as it comes from someone like Agamben, or the idea of measure, which in fact we've talked in conjunction with the work of James Hillman. The problem in psychology and psychoanalysis of how is it, for example, that an analyst knows the pain and suffering, the pathology of a particular analysand and the problem of knowledge. And so all of those problems, I think, converge on the question of measure and energy too. And I mean, maybe just to sort of, give a context for the question, in this chapter on Bataille, you talk about how, for example, with the coming of the modern age, energy was understood in a radically new way to the extent that it could be known, calculated, measured, and so forth. And this brought about many problems. And Blake, in particular, is somebody who resisted the onset of this new paradigm. And without going into too many details, I think the question is there a way of understanding energy? Is there a way of understanding any kind of energy, be it psychological energy, be it the energy of the sun or labor power, that does not reduce it to something measurable and employable for rational ends? And so another way to put that is, can energy be known in terms of inoperativity, acting or moving in ways that exceed measure and utility? And I see it as not only being a problem of the ontology of energy, but also the epistemology. And on page 197 of the book, you cite a line by Michael Marder from his book, Energy Dreams. And it seems like you're citing it, laudatorily, where you say, let another energy work and dream as it gushes forth from the fault lines of the productivist worldview. So simply put, on one side, we have the productivist notion of energy, but there's this other notion of energy that seems, at least in Marder's case, bound up with dream, imagination, or what have you. When we look at somebody like Hillman, for example, he's going to say that the logos of understanding psyche is very different from a scientific logos. It's a logos of the imagination. It's not a knowing of, but a knowing inside the image. And I think this ultimately, this is just a big question that we've talked about on Acid Horizon, is is there a way of ontologizing inoperativity, or is it an anti-ontology? Must we understand it negatively? Or is there a way that we can understand a kind of work that doesn't fall into the productivist view?
That's such a great, rich question, Craig. Thank you. Maybe we could start with this question of inoperativity, right? Because, right, the very word energy comes from the Greek word for work, right? So energy and inoperativity are being unworking, right, are closely kind of connected, as if not exactly dialectical opposites, certainly kind of opposed and yet related. So this notion of inoperativity as a kind of against a productivist worldview that we see of the work of Gambin, of Nancy's The Inoperative Community, of someone like Blanchot, and all of these kind of prominent thinkers in so many, I think in all three of these cases and in others, they refer, although often ambivalently, back to Bataille, right? And so in some ways, this whole kind of discourse of inoperativity, désœuvrement in the French and in the 20th century thought, which is often explicitly related to a certain kind of communism, but an anti-Stalinist and anti-productivist notion of communism, goes back to Bataille and his writings on kind of the unemployed negativity and on kind of excess energy, right? But what was so interesting to me, so I do discuss this, and I think this is really important. This is a tradition that I highlight and that I bring out. But what I think is the kind of what I hope is the contribution of the book is to show that when Bataille was formulating this idea of excess energy that became so influential and inoperativity, he was doing so at every turn reading Blake. So these quotations of Blake like pop up all over his work, and he's drawing not just quotations but poetic images, but actually like ideas and real thinking, right? Poetic thinking from this English poet. And he did read English, and Bataille did, and he translated Blake. Translated Blake's poetry into French. And so this is one moment in the book where I try to show that these 20th century and contemporary theoretical discourses that are, I think, really important and make kind of clarifying for our present and make demands on us are generated in dialogue with romantic writers, right? Like the kind of to be very simplistic, the non kind of identitarian nationalist strains of Romanticism. It's this revolutionary Romanticism that Bataille, Blanchot, someone like Fred Moten, Rancière, these other thinkers are reading these poets and drawing on them. Right? Blake and the Bataille is just one example. But in that example, I do think it's really crucial to show how this very notion of inoperativity has a kind of poetic genesis, that it comes from a poet and that it is about also a more poetic bearing or comportment toward whether it be work or energy or economy, right? How do we think about these things under the aspect of their excess rather than a kind of capture and accumulation of these things? Right? And I think it's literature, poetry, and romanticism that gives us tools for like thinking and practice around this question.
I'll just say quickly, I've read Blanchot's The Unavowable Community a few times in my life now, and in the translator's foreword, Pierre Joris offers a description of désœuvrement, unworking, in a way that almost poses it as a kind of positive concept, just very briefly, but we don't get that in the actual book, and I felt deeply unsatisfied by that mention. I mean, I'll just put that out there. That's not the way that I wanted to follow it up. But I think one of the risks that the concept of inoperativity that we're putting forward here engenders is, does this then pose poetry against science or against metaphysics in some way? Or is there a way that the world of knowledge as we ordinarily know it, scientific knowledge anyway, can work in conjunction with poetry? Or are these necessarily angled against one another in some way?
This is such a great question. I mean, I'm going to give a kind of really broad, quick answer and then a very, very local answer. Because this is too big. I mean, there's also like science and poetry. I wish I could illuminate that connection. But the really broad and quick answer is it's really common in a kind of more conventional narrative to see the Romantics as kind of anti-science, anti-enlightenment, anti-mechanistic worldviews. And that's true to a certain extent, but it's also true that there were so many of the major Romantic figures were like reading the science of their day and really closely engaging with it. Like Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, that's just one of many examples, right? But there is also this real ambivalence there. But let me give you the much more local answer to Blake and Bataille. Okay. So when Bataille's formulating his his idea of general economy and his critique of restricted economy, these are his words, right? The general economy being a kind of economy essentially of excess, of the infinite energy that comes from the sun, right? That can never be fully captured. Whereas a restricted economy has it's a closed system, right? In some of his early notes for thinking about this, he goes back to the 1820s, but not to read Romantics this time, but to talk about the formulation of thermodynamics with Sadi Carnot. And he has a strong critique of thermodynamics that, it's like, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to, it's philosophical, conceptual critiques. It's not so much a scientific critique, so I'm not going to litigate the science there, but I think there's a really valuable lesson, and it allows Bataille to think about the question of energy, from like solar energy all the way down to labor power and even poetry, he says, right? In a connected general way as part of one kind of system that is open rather than a kind of more mechanistic closed. I'm simplifying, but I think so I do think there is a kind of, and again, he's doing this critique of thermodynamics, I argue, reading Blake, right? Who's a contemporary of this formulation of this kind of mechanistic system. So that's just that one example, but I do think it's a really interesting kind of test case for thinking about poetry and science and how they don't necessarily have to be strictly opposed, but a kind of, the question is not so much like the discourse of poetry and the discourse of science, but starting with actually reading literal poems, how can we think about a more poetic bearing or epistemology that is open to excess in every different domain that we might be studying, whether it be economy or science or ecology or whatever, right? It's always about this opening to excess that is a shared opening that allows us to think a kind of common being that's not closed or grounded or captured within one system.
Yeah, I think that the question of like placing inoperativity next to science, it's a question of what we mean by scientia, right? Like, is it an art of unfolding particular things about the world, or is it attempting to inframe and establish new ways to frack oil? Like the question of ends or the open is really what is at stake here. And poetry is what puts this disposition and comportment towards our embeddedness in the world at stake. Science doesn't do that. It can throw us into crisis. It can fucking kill all of us. But poetry does, at least for thinkers like Ben, and certainly Bataille. The first essay in the new critical volume, poetry is about that excess. And I think that if inoperativity is to be a sort of an ethics, it would have to take up the same problematization of the history of the notion of life that poetry has done to language. And I think that's really what the interlude, the sunray of the negative, did for me. I think the passages on energeia and ergon were really elucidated that.
That's beautiful. Can I add in one quick footnote to that? If you don't mind, just to clarify something for the listeners, maybe like why, just try to justify like why am I associating excess with poetry? Is it just because I think they're cool? But just to be like a little bit more specific, and I've already said, poetry is also it's about measure, right? So how can it be about excess? But the reason I'm interested in poetry as this kind of common excess is because poetry is a certain free use of language that is detached from its communicative content, right?
Right.
So it's by definition an excessive use of language, right?
I love that.
If a poem was just something that that you just wanted to communicate, like I want a sandwich, or you wouldn't need a poem. You would just say I want a sandwich to like have this kind of communicative content, right? But poetry is, if you say I want a sandwich in a poem, well, you've opened up a whole other world, right? So I just want to add that footnote. I think poetry is perched between measure and excess in language, and that's why it's so useful for thinking about these issues in other domains.
And it reminds me of your distinction going all the way back to all things common. You make a real clear distinction here between use and ownership. I mean, poetry is a relationship to language predicated on use, whereas enclosure is something that can only operate, at least according to like the Lockean, even Rousseauian, but a different part of Rousseau, in conception of property. And I think that connects back to Craig's question of scientific inquiry. It goes down to a function of whether or not it's participating in a particular mode of inframing the world, to use the Heideggerian term. So I think that while you're ambivalent on these notions of measure, at least in poetry, measure becomes a question of use and not a question of registering something as ownable, manipulable, manageable, etc. And then I just have a question. Who are some of your favorite contemporary poets?
Yeah. Well, to start, there's some contemporary poetry in this book, although it's not central. That kind of contemporary 20th century contemporary poets kind of pop up occasionally. So the late Len Haginian and the late Alice Notley, two poets who have just died in the last year or two, are really, really dear to me. Other poets that are in this book that I love are someone like Rob Halpern, Fred Moten's poetry. But beyond people that I talk about in this book, my favorite living contemporary poet is probably Nathaniel Mackey, who writes in a kind of amazing, kind of mythic register that is also extremely kind of haunting and very beautiful and very philosophical as well. So he's one that I recommend to everyone. Yeah, Nate Mackey.
It's a very interesting discussion to come into. So I've recently finished my first sort of, I guess, poetry zine, and there's definitely like a Bataillean problem to it in which I have no idea how to justify the fact that I've written this, to justify the very medium itself. I mean, given we all sort of do like quite technical sort of analyses of philosophical problems, this poem could have been an essay. There is something so excessive to it. I mean, there's a real Bataillean sense in which poetry is shit. Not in the sense that poetry is bad, but in the sense that it is a complete leaving. And if we use measure, we're not measuring out something useful. We're using it to articulate the rhythms of our own sort of literary excrement, not in the sense that it's base, in the sense that it's bad. We're all good Batailleans here, but in the sense that this didn't need to happen, yet we felt compelled to do so. And in terms of the use of measure, I mean, there's nothing more boring than when you're sort of GCSE students, I guess not high school. I don't know how your schools work in the US. I'm not going to modify it here.
We don't really have them here anymore. We just have people wandering
SATs. Yeah. Like, so if the students, like the first student is you do poetry and you learn iambic pentameter, and then suddenly everything is iambic pentameter because you're trying to make it equivalent to a Shakespearean poem or just a very restricted poems in which you have been taught in this enclosed means of teaching language. And it is just fascinating discussion about how, yes, it's dealing with the problem of poetry being so needlessly excessive, but in terms of the history of, let's say, an idea of the Western canon, especially coming from someone like Harold Bloom, who already mentioned, is that everything is poetic. The Greeks are basically built around the idea of Homer. Homer is built around the idea of Homer. And so I wanted to ask about, in a way, going on this sort of very Bataillean thread of the mode of consumption, the mode of excretion being the determining thing about a social setup, even more than the mode of production, because the mode of production even itself leads to excretion. If you are a chef, your job is to curate the experience of the pre-shit. Hegel once says this to a letter to one of the Prussian education ministers, which got him censured quite a bit, which was that if you believe that the presence of God is really in the wafer of the host, you are worshipping the rat shit it will be later. And there is a genuine problem here of the social use of this excess through poetry. I'd like to ask about if there's a groundlessness of community here, is this groundlessness expressed in a sort of a latent social formation that could be a world that could be free in the form of poetry? And are you sort of talking about romantic poetry as, to use a phrase, talk about the coming community or the latent community? If you talk me into Fred Moten, the undercommons, what's already sitting amongst us.
Yeah, just to say something about the first part of your question. Well, that's really exciting that you wrote a made poetry zine. I'd love to read it. You don't need to justify it. This is what I wanted to say. Like poetry is radically, it is the radically non-justifiable, and in that way, it is language actually in its innermost essence, right? Which is, I think poetic language, in a sense, I would say ontologically precedes language used for communication, and this is why, if you want to get into the kind of like post-Heideggerian Agamben, languages are dwelling, right? So we have to figure out how to dwell poetically on this earth, right? But to say it's radically it's anti and non-justifiable and indifferent to any justification is also to say that it's groundless, right? Like there's no measured reason for it, right? Yeah. So on the question of like, and you didn't use this word, but I also maybe another kind of related word to some of the things that you were putting forward, Adam, is like prefigurative, right? Like, is poetry kind of prefigure the coming community or something? I do kind of think that. I do. I do think there is a communist desire latent in poetry as such. Like, I'll die on that hill, right? This is kind of my orientation, right? Now, what does this mean, right? Does it mean that like reading poetry will get us to the revolution, right? Will produce communism? No, I don't actually think that. But what I do think is that poetry is a certain experience of language at a pitch of intensity that gives us a kind of foretaste of like a common life without grounds, without measure, without external compulsions on our relations to each other and to ourselves and to the earth, right? And so what it can do, right? Like, I don't have any illusions again about it. Romantic as I may be, as I said, I don't think it's just going to automatically produce some great outcome, right? If we just read more poetry, everything will turn out right. No, it's like poetry is, and poetry, broadly speaking, meaning literary language or experiences of art, certain aesthetic experiences, right? Not only poetry, but so using that as a kind of umbrella term, poetry reconfigures our sensorium, right? Poetry gives us like a sense of the common, right? The sensus communis in a radically renewed, open, and like, let's say, unenclosed way. And in this sense, I think it aligns with the early Romantic Marx, right? Where it talks about poetry is the emancipation of the senses. You can think about it like that. That's what I think.
Yeah, there tends, like, I just want to jump in now and be like, the debate that's going on in academia around Marx, because there is a Marxist academia. I'm sorry to everyone on the internet. You can actually be a Marxist and survive in academia. It just depends on what kind of Marxist you are. The debate seems to be Marx was an Enlightenment thinker. No, Marx was not an Enlightenment thinker. But what always gets papered over is the Romanticism of Marx. It seems to be either an embarrassing childhood blunder or something that got left behind in the thing that at least the post-Althusserian, when we call like the epistemic scientific turn. So, that's one of the things that I'm glad this book at least opens the door to, which is to show the continuity between the history of communism as an intellectual movement too, and Romanticism.
Totally.
Just to build on sort of the history of this sort of communist project. I mean, as you mentioned, your translation of Hölderlin's poems, poetic essay, poetic fragment, The Communism of Spirits. And there's a really interesting figure of communism in that, which is it's a kind of, listeners, it's a kind of federated monastic order. As if you all live in like kind of monastically run states, we're all sort of laboring together for a common literary culture. And it's really interesting as well because that idea does not get picked up. And I don't believe it's picked up through Hölderlin, but it is not picked up until about 1929, until it's picked up by a man called Roger Caillois in an essay, The Winter Wind, in a presentation for A Front for the Acephal Cult. And there's a really interesting through line there from Hölderlin, somewhat the dark horse of the German idealist movement, I guess. Not of his own account, mostly because of these ways he was treated by the establishment around the ideas of mental health and such, towards Bataille and Caillois as this idea of communism being a kind of equally groundless, but also nonetheless still a religia, thing that binds. Not in some sense a religion. And so I can't help but tease out, like I'll tease out some of the Hölderlinian implications of the poetic language used here.
I love the line from Hölderlin to Asif all. That's whether it's a direct or probably more indirect. That's where I sign up, I think. I've been reading this really interesting French thinker, Dionys Mascolo, who's not really been translated, but he was kind of friends with Blanchot and this kind of post-war radical left, but not Communist Party in France scene. And he says somewhere that the word communism belongs as much to Hölderlin as it does to Marx, right? Which is a bit of a kind of polemical statement, but an interesting one. Because
I can go further. I'm going to go further right here, and I'm going to say, you can be a Marxist in academia so long as you are not a communist. Like, as long as you are not a communist, you can be as Marxist as you like. And I think that Mascolo is one of those thinkers like Blanchot that until probably very soon has just been overlooked.
Can I interrupt you, Will? If you're going to send hate mail to Acid Horizon, please don't do it through the main account or on the website. Find Will's Twitter and get him there. I'm sorry, Joe. Please go ahead.
There's an irony in that Mascolo statement. Let's just go back to that, right? Because of course, belongs. The word belongs. The word communism of all words belongs to no one and to everyone, right? But I guess this would bring us back to language and the word as a certain kind of prefigurative sharing, maybe.
As I'm thinking about things as we're going through these issues, I'm thinking about calling this episode Towards a Romantic Communism? ? I mean, just clickbait, right? But let's think about that for a moment in our time, because one of the risks that you flagged up that was engendered by the romantics in the Romantic period was being nostalgic, just generally speaking, but we could be nostalgic about Romanticism too, right? In our time, especially if we attempt to reclaim that term under the banner of communism. And of course, we can be nostalgic about communism, and we have seen the risks that has entailed in certain spaces. But does the fact that we're dealing with what seems to be an apocalyptic reality, things like climate change, what do you think would be different about a romantic communism today versus the kind of proto-communism of the romantics that you're highlighting in your book? Not to be too prescriptive, but are there intimations of that in places, in spaces that we encounter?
Yeah. Well, I do think you're right, Craig, to put the accent on a possibility of a radical ecological politics in this, age of climate collapse and the Anthropocene. And there is a lot that we can learn from the Romantics and their view of nature today, which is much more complicated than the kind of, nature worship, go out, look at some trees. It's actually a much more, it's a stranger and more tense relation that the Romantics have with nature. And so I do think that's something I think that we need today. It goes back to dwelling poetically on the earth. But when I think about like the uprisings of the earth movement in France, right? These huge kind of mass insurgent actions against, industrial projects that are environmentally destructive. I don't know too much about the actual inspirations in terms of like literature for the people involved in that. But I would want to think of that as a kind of like, in terms of drawing a line from the proto-communism of the Romantics to kind of radical movements today. Yeah, that's one one place I would go, the uprisings of the earth, to think about dwelling differently on the earth and not just peacefully, but as a kind of insurgent tactic as well, or something like, defend the forest in Atlanta, right? Recent years in the U.S. I do think there is in these movements a romantic and a poetic bearing towards recovering some kind of collective struggle that is, for me at least, like in step with the kind of radical, groundless romanticism that I try to delineate and that I take inspiration from. Yeah.
I mean, I just want to share with you a kind of personal sentiment. If you know this about me, I live in an extremely idyllic environment. And I often wonder, too, if idyllic thinking in general, the way that we think idyllically, is a luxury of our society that's counterposed with, in 2025 anyway, with at least the image of oncoming apocalypse and in many places and spaces, real apocalypse, whether it's a wildfire or floods or what have you. And I am in contact with all kinds of wildlife and bugs and everything all day long in a way that would be very appealing to somebody with romantic inclinations. But at the same time, there's a kind of image that I often indulge that sits between these idyllic musings and these apocalyptic musings, which is when I see deer, like I have these 3 beautiful bucks that are just around my place right now, and the fawns and the does and all kinds of wild turkeys and everything else besides. And it occurs to me now and again, like they are in the community, so to speak. They are in common with me. It's a sort of reminder that you don't often get in an urban space. And it's in that moment that I recognize that for me, that's kind of a middle between the idyllic and the apocalyptic, is this acknowledgement of being in common with this alterity. I'm articulating that sentiment in real time right now, but if any of that sort of maps onto the way that you're thinking about the commons today.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is like, I think, something that comes through in the other meaning of the word common, which is ordinary. Right, or every day. And this is something that's also, gets discussed in the book a good bit, right? The common is both shared and ordinary. So it is precisely kind of neither this pure nostalgic ideal, right? Pastoral, perfection, nor is it always this apocalyptic, at least most of the time, right? Like volcanoes erupting or whatever, but rather it is like the struggle of how to live and reproduce ourselves and our communities, which include the non-human beings with which we share the earth, right? Like in the everyday, right? According to these immanent rhythms that constitute us and then are, and also open us up and change and become dispersed and reconstituted, right? It is about like, it is, I don't know if I want to say like middle ground, right? But middle groundless maybe, right? It is about like the ordinary. Is an emphasis on like the fact that we already have what we need, right? This, or to go back to Adam, right? This coming community is also kind of already immanent in some way, right? In our everyday life. This is something that I think is really important for the Romantics, and that I take from that, right? It's not, no one's coming to save us, right? But we have actually what we need and what surrounds us. But at the same time, a lot needs to change.
I think it's really, I really like how you're highlighting sort of the immanence here, particularly of community, and the fact that we do have, in a way, everything we need. We're just not in the world is plentiful. The cosmos, in the biblical sense of the ordering, is not. But I had to ask, in terms of like the romantic poetic outlook, is there also a kind of an additional sort of spectre haunting, in the sense of an idea of, let's say, utopia? Because it is immanent in the sense it's all here. The good place is here, but also it's not, because we're not living in it. And if anything, the idea of the common measure of all things, at least by poetry, would be, in a sense, kind of utopian, because we're all pining for it, even though we're immersed in its shadow, which is the presence is here, but also completely negative. Not to go to full Derrida, although maybe we are going to full Derrida at this point. I just wanted to ask how these ideas of community relate to a concept of utopia. Is utopia sort of something that is constantly being deferred in romantic poetry? Is it being deferred in the sense that utopia is both the good place and not here, whereas they want to rearticulate a notion of not a utopian, but just an immanent goodness, but is being constantly repressed or is exceeding the bounds of its containment? I mean, how would you understand the problem of utopia in this kind of paradigm?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a historical link there too, because as you know well, right, utopian socialism in 19th century France is Fourier and others is often is like romantic socialism is kind of interchangeably used with that term, right? So there's a kind of way in which Proudhon and Fourier, and in England someone like Robert Owen, right, these people that are kind of go under this umbrella of utopian socialism are, they're contemporaries with the Romantics, the people that I'm writing about and interested in. And there are some kind of historical connections there. But I do think it is important to like delineate a difference, both from that this particular delimited historical movement of utopian socialism in the 19th century, and maybe a broader, like a more general view of utopia. It's not a term I mobilize much, but it does come up a few times. Although now I feel like I'm very, very cautious about. My partner's doing a dissertation on the utopia, so I'm like constantly, in kind of debates and discussions with them about the refinements of this concept, and so I like am now very wary about using it kind of casually, as I did a little bit in the book, but. To maybe get away from just the valences of this term, I'm really ambivalent about this question of deferral, right? I kind of want to have my cake and eat it too, but I'm not quite sure how to think about it, right? And it goes back to the same question of like the immanence versus, the non-identity of utopia in the present, right? We live in this fracture, right? Or this, in the dark light of the shadow it casts. I mean, there's a great line by Percy Shelley where he talks about we live in the gigantic shadows futurity casts upon the present, right? Is what he says. And I think, first of all, poetry is a way of like trying to see in those dark shadows and kind of decipher some of the hieroglyphs that they're transmitting back to us, right? But one thing that, at least for this kind of strain of romanticism that I'm interested in, that has to be refused is utopia as a destination. Right? Like as a telos, because that would make it a kind of a principle and a ground for action that could be arrived at. Whereas I'm rather more interested in a kind of maybe not deferring, but a kind of ceaseless excess, ceaseless negativity that is always displacing all of our constituted social forms in the present to break them open. Right. And so there will never be a final endpoint, right? I think, but rather dwelling or living poetically would be like living according to the kind of the rhythms that spiral out of this movement of displacement, right? They always are making kind of new relations possible, but never like fully. So it's not a trajectory of actualization, I would say. Right, if we want to get real Agamben with it, but it's rather a kind of thinking about how to live in displacement and ungrounding.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I'm just going to close by stating, sort of in the spirit of your book, that perhaps the question of community is precisely that it fades upon its founding. And I think that's what we've been left with at the end of this conversation. Not to sound Derridian, which I think we've been pretty guilty of, I think at certain points, but that is the problematic that I think we've laid out. But in fact, it is that very negativity that is so desperately needed. So again, I'd like to thank you. The book is 50% off right now. Yeah, and it's one of those
US and Canada. Books. I must highlight that. I've just checked. In the US and Canada, sadly, nothing is being shipped in or out of your continent for some time.
And then, what's some work that you're doing right now? Now that you've done the big academic book, what is sitting on your desk as we speak?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's been such a pleasure to speak with y'all. That's been really fun. So I've got an essay on Keats and Marx that I've been working on for a long time, and that is kind of almost done, or basically done, but still not published. So I'm excited about that. But less academically, I've been doing a lot of writing about this late poet who's, I didn't mention a few moments ago, Will, when you asked me about my favorite contemporary poets, but he's certainly near the top, Sean Bonney. And so I'm writing earlier this year, I published a kind of series of fragments about his poetry in relation to revolutionary time and calendars. And I'm thinking about turning that into a short book. So that's on the horizon potentially. But yeah, continuing to do a lot with poetry and thinking about time and revolution.
Well, when it moves from potentiality to Aragon, we're happy to have you on again. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. This was great.